Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm really excited about this conversation we're going to have today. Kolby Reddish and I have become very good friends. We've actually never personally met, but we spent many, many hours on the phone, and of course,
I
many
have to
hours.
correct you, Steve. We did meet at my first Sunstone, but I was just a rando. You wouldn't have known who I was.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't even. Oh, you were just a rando.
Yeah.
You aren't anymore, my friend. So that's good. I love it. So, but Colby and I have had a series of conversations actually on the phone. And about 3 weeks ago, I went to Colby and I was like, dude, I think we need to record some of these conversations because I think they're very helpful, showing that we can come from opposite views on particular topics and engage them very civilly. And I think now more than ever, with the recent events, with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we were both very shook up over this whole thing. But we decided that, you know what, we still need to have this conversation. So it's Sunday, September 14th at 2:15 p.m. And the events have transpired over the last course of the last 4 days have really altered the landscape here in America, the political discourse. It has also greatly impacted the space we occupy, which is in just the Mormon podcast world, and how we've had lots of conflicts and lots of people going at each other for years now. And maybe it's time that we do lower the temperature. My biggest concern, and I did a live stream the other day, was, what's it going to take? Is it going to be one of us getting shot after if somebody says something nasty about another podcaster? It doesn't really matter what size of the aisle at this point. We really need to be careful and choose our words and how we say things. I think we can get our ideas across, and we can choose to do it in a civil way, or we could choose to do it in a way that could cause more and more contention and strife that could lead to situations that happened recently in Orem, Utah. Colby, welcome to the program, and I'm so glad we're going to have this conversation today.
Me too, Steve. Me too. And I think especially, I mean, we had already planned to do this before the events of this week, and we've seen a rise of political violence over the course of the last several years. And I think this latest event has really driven home to me that this next week is Constitution Day, September 17th, right? And when you and I talked on September 10th, the day Charlie was assassinated, I had just had the day before, had helped host and moderate a Constitution Day event a week ahead of time that talked about the promises of the Constitution, and talked about the speaker, Professor Neil Siegel, actually talked about how um, he talked about how we've seen this rise in political violence and how it has only gotten worse over the last several years. And then, of course, the very next day, we're watching those horrifying events unfold. And I think as I've reflected a lot, I've been really heartbroken seeing responses from people on both sides. I would never condone or celebrate anyone's death. I think that's abhorrent, and I'm disgusted by that type of behavior. I also think calls to hold one side or the other accountable for the violence that happened to Kirk at the hands of this madman are very irresponsible. And I've been very happy and pleased as I've seen people recognize that if we continue to head down this road of rhetoric and we continue to head down this road of division, that no one wins in that scenario. And so I have seen a lot of people in the past several days soften, and that's emboldened me. And in fact is probably going to change the way I navigate this space going forward, showing people more charity, um, ensuring that any criticism is accurate and about as kind as it can be phrased. But yeah, as we had already planned to do this discussion, I just feel like it dovetails really well because it helps show why these conversations with people that we may not share all of our opinions with are worthwhile, and that we can find our point of disagreement without vilifying each other, without calling one side evil, without using labels to write someone off. And that's I think what I wanted to hope we could accomplish today. I think a few, thoughts I've had about how do we do that, and I'd love any that you have too. I think one of the things that I've encountered so often in this space is oftentimes our disagreements are just a it's a disagreement on the way we define words. Like the term at the bottom can sometimes be where the actual dispute is. You know, you may define a term one way, and I may define a term another way. The truth is that words, while we have dictionaries that give us definitions, those are descriptive, right? They describe how we use terms. They're not prescriptive. Words are just a label that we use to assign meaning to actual relationships between objects or between ourselves. Like the differences, the comparison between two things is real, but the term that we come to use is made up. The example I think of all the time is like if I have two apples sitting on the table, the number two, like the relationship of having two objects, is an actual real substantive thing, right? And it's different than one object or it's different than three, and it's half of four objects. But the fact that we've decided to call that concept of the number two is completely arbitrary. It's a number, it's just a word that we've assigned things. And so I think my first tip on how to like model bridge building and honest conversations would be to start by framing the discussion around terms. Because if you disagree on terms, you may be able to find other terms that you can use as a stand-in for the purposes of that conversation that can allow you to move forward instead of just fighting back and forth without realizing when I use this term that we're debating about, it means something different to me than the other person is hearing it.
Okay, so just out of curiosity, do you have some maybe, and then maybe putting you on the spot here, but do you have some world examples of how people use terms differently and words differently, and how that we can apply that to the conversation we're having?
Um, Let me think of one. Yeah, I think here's one that I see all of the time. The word lie or liar.
Okay.
To me, the word liar automatically connotes intent, right? It means that the person knows that what they're saying is not accurate.
Mhm.
The effect of communicating false information or information that isn't necessarily true, and by true I mean real, bears a relationship to reality, can also be a result of mistake, right? So there's this law that it's just a law of exchanges that we should presume good intent when we can. And so a lie to me is one that I see all the time where I see people accuse people of lying. And it's like, they're not lying if they really believe what they're saying. I know it's a joke that dates back to a great episode of Seinfeld where Costanza says, "Remember, Jerry, it's not a lie if you believe it." And of course, he's using it to help Jerry evade this polygraph test. But there's some truth to the idea that we shouldn't accuse people of being a liar unless we know or can have a good reason to believe, I guess, that their intent is to deceive people.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think when I navigate the space, when we navigate this space, where especially the people on Facebook or on Reddit and other platforms where they attack you and accuse, and I get attacked for from Christians who say that I'm not really a Christian or an evangelical. I get attacked by people on the far right spectrum accusing me of truly horrible, vile things that I'm afraid, would set off somebody to do harm to me and perhaps my mom. Then I have people in the ex-Mormon space
Hmm.
that resent the fact that I'm a believer, or that maybe I'm too friendly to the church. And then, I mean, but the things they say, and they can do it relatively anonymously, especially on Reddit, but even on Facebook. And I often just I do the Zoom call challenge. Just say, listen, rather than put up the charade of this public stuff, why don't you and I have an off the record conversation
Hmm.
about your concerns that you have, and
Hmm.
and the allegations that you're making against me.
Hmm.
And only one person ever in all the years that I've been doing this has taken me up on that offer, and that's Chino Blanco, who was one of the founders of the ex-Mormon Reddit.
Yeah.
He said some stuff that I felt was unfair. Specifically, he said stuff about John Dehlin and I that I felt was not fair. And I called him out, and I threw out the Zoom call challenge to him, and I ended up having a wonderful conversation with this guy. And last year, he came on my program to give an oral history of the early days of the ex-Mormon Reddit, which I think is an important conversation to
Mhm.
have
Yeah, I
and will be
remember that
useful.
episode.
And so we had, and he's only done two interviews ever, once on Mormon Stories and once here. And he said he'd probably be another 10 years before he does another interview. But I felt like this was productive. In other words, okay, a person lays out what I think was an unfair criticism, but I also wanted to better understand where they're coming from. So I give them the opportunity to have a conversation with me. They have that conversation. We end up becoming friends, and we
Hmm.
end up having a productive episode in which now, 50 years from now, if people are doing studies on the ex-Mormon movement in the early 21st century, they'll be able to reference that interview about the early days of the ex-Mormon Reddit, right?
Hmm.
And so to me, everybody benefits from that. And so now if Chino attacks me, I'm like, that's all right, man. Because I know at any moment I can do the Zoom call challenge. I'd be more than happy to step up and have that conversation with me. Now for
I actually had a very similar experience, Steve, and I am only mentioning it because you connected me with this person. There was another lawyer, a believing member lawyer, that had some criticisms of some things I had said, talking about the Huntsman lawsuit, and you had asked, "Hey, this person reached out to me because they had seen that we'd done episodes before. Do you mind if I give them your contact information and you guys can talk?" And I won't use his name or anything because I haven't like cleared it with him. But we had this conversation where it started by him shooting me like a gigantic email full of, I would say, a lot of aspersions, a lot of assumptions about my motivation, a lot of criticisms, some of which were fair, some of which were not. Then we started to have a text message conversation that was similarly really negative. And I remember just being so angry after one of the text messages he sent that I just decided, you know what? I'm just going to call this person. I'm just going to call him and we're going to talk. And we talked for, I don't remember how long that night, but it was so much more productive to talk and humanize each other. And it was kind of a similar situation. I mean, I would consider that we ended our conversations on friendly terms and we've texted back and forth a few times since then. And I hope he does as well. I hope that was a productive conversation, but it's the same type of thing you're talking about. Like, I guess that's one of the ways that we can humanize each other is we need to be willing to have conversations with people who do disagree with us. We don't need to just retreat to our echo chambers and do polemics, you know. And I know there would be probably some in your audience that think that's rich coming from me because I've criticized certain apologists in the past. Um, I've tried to keep my criticisms to their work, but I know there have been times because I'm human that I've stepped over that line.
Mhm.
And there are many times I feel like those criticisms, because I have brought receipts, are fair, but
Mhm.
I know that it's never fun to get criticisms about your work or your beliefs. And so I know that one of the things I plan to do as a result of this is to be more charitable in my criticisms. And when I say as a result of this, I mean as a result of recognizing that we need greater civility in this country and in our discourse and in this space. I know it is going to soften me going forward. And I will also say at the same time, there has not been a single person I've criticized, believing apologist or anyone else, that I'm not willing to have a conversation with and have made those offers every single time. And you've actually helped communicate some of those offers. So I think if we were to, you know, drive the last few minutes of conversation to another tip on how to model good conversations, it would be actually being willing to have the conversation.
Amen. And I think that's so important. And you and I have had conversations where we've kind of even acknowledged our blind spots, maybe,
100%.
and maybe changed our view of something or way or thinking because like, oh, and it's our willingness to continue. I always tell people I'm always looking to eliminate blind spots. I
Hmm.
really truly want to have be and serve the truth, be somebody who's gives out good information. If I ever give out bad information, that I correct that kind of thing. Um, and also I want to be honest with my audience, and so it really hurts me. Like if I were to say something that wasn't true that another podcaster said to me, and they knew it wasn't true, that's like and they thought it was funny that I put this untruthful thing out there. That really bothered me because it was so unprofessional. And so that's also too is the responsibility of being content creators. Now, of course, you're not your own podcaster, but you go on so many different podcasts that in one sense you are a content creator as a guest and as a collaborator on many platforms. So there is this also responsibility of being semi-public people who have a platform and have a community and have an audience to uh, be aware of stuff that we say does have an impact on people's lives in a
Mhm.
way that you don't even realize it. Like I or even guests or topics I talk about. I met a family that got baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ at their general conference in Western Pennsylvania, and what set them on that journey was an interview I did with an apologist or an evangelist at that church, Josh Gailey, and
Mhm.
that really struck me. Like I'm looking at this family, I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is more than just some kind of hobby where I like to talk about the restoration. People's lives are genuinely impacted, and I have to remind myself of that all the time, and how to be how in the great responsibility I have because people's lives are getting affected by this program, and that humbles me greatly. And maybe just talk about how you see it, Colby. Like, here you are, you're doing a lot of work with RFM and with John DeLynn, and of course you've been collaborating with me. How do you see yourself as being a public person, and how what kind of responsibilities that entails and burdens?
Oh man, that's such a great question. The burdens for sure are higher than I would have expected. So when you get criticisms, sent to your employer of something you said on a podcast, um, that can be really hard. That's happened to me multiple times. I've had multiple times that people have tried to call my employer and get me fired, for things that I've said on a podcast, and I'm not necessarily saying that there can't be consequences for things that people say, but I don't think anything I've ever said has ever risen to that level. I view my role in the whatever you want to call it, the Exmo creator space, as simply just being willing to collaborate with people and have interesting conversations when I'm asked. I also tend to um, think of it as like responsive. Like my role is more responsive. Like I usually am responding to like obviously RFM and we've done over 50 hours responding to the Light and Truth letter by Austin Fife, right? And I know that Austin is not a fan of that work, but I can sincerely say like a lot of the criticisms and the work we've done on that has been honest and good intentioned in just trying to reach the truth or help people who have heard of the Light and Truth letter or that it's been used against them by a believing family member. And not all believers are that way. I just know that I've heard from at least a dozen people. And Austin has even shared, I think, in his conversation with you, that he's heard that his book has been used that way. In my view, my role in like the counter apologetic space, if that's what you want to call it, is just helping people make sense of the information. And the truth is, anyone who's reached out to me privately, which at this point I was keeping track at one point, but I've lost count. They can tell you that I have never encouraged anyone to leave the church because leaving the church is a huge change in lifestyle and it's very, very difficult. It's actually one of the things, as I've now been out 3 years, 3.5 years, that I've recognized I probably needed to treat with a little bit better respect and a little bit more sensitivity earlier when I would appear on podcasts or probably more on Reddit. It was like, if you don't think it's true, you just need to leave. I am definitely a lot more sympathetic to recognizing that not everyone values like absolute dedication to what can we prove to be true the same way that other people do. There are people who find value in religion beyond the truth claims. I usually call that like the utility type conversation. And so I think to come back to not just answer your question, but to the first thing I said about definitions, is I think that's where we have to be really clear about the actual critique as far as what we're actually critiquing. So to answer your question, I really only try and have the discussions about actual truth claims. And on those actual truth claims, I want to give people accurate information, but they don't necessarily have to decide to reach the same conclusion I do. I would also hope that there have been people who can listen to my perspective and just get a better understanding for family members that maybe cannot believe in the truth claims of the church, even if that person that's listening continues to. And I know there have been several people who have reached out to me and expressed that in the past. That always makes me really happy. It might surprise people, but one of the messages that I'm always the most mixed about is when someone will message me and say that something I said caused them to leave the church. Um, like I said, that's a huge life change. And I have gained a lot more perspective over the last couple of years that that path is not the easiest or best for everybody's life.
I appreciate that, and that's actually something I struggle with too, because I've been on record for years now, and I said I would feel terrible if somebody left the church because of something I did or said on my channel. Um, because and then I got my haters on the apologetic side attack me for that without the full context of my point being is that when you leave the church, you're not just going from one church and going to the across the street to the Presbyterian church. No, it's much more different than that in this space. It could affect your livelihood, your familial relationships, um, just it could be devastating to people.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's the when I say I'd feel terrible, that's what I'm talking about because I recognize that the great sacrifices people have to make. And that's the other thing though. I remember I got an email from a woman who told me she says she was about to leave the church, but she said you showed me a way that I could still be a follower of Christ and be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That she didn't have to leave because and then I even say it's like it doesn't matter what building you go to. If you have a personal relationship with the Savior, you're a Christian.
Sure. Sure.
And so I think there's Christians in all sects and denominations, and that's the body of Christ. And you don't have to go to a building on Sunday to say that you're a Christian. You can go to
Mhm.
any building or no building on
Mhm.
Saturday or Sunday or whatever day you worship, um, and still be part of the Christian community. And once people can understand that better, it makes it kind of like, oh, like say just we need to just be a little bit more imaginative in how we in our thoughts here. It's we become so just black and white thinking, right? Manchian thinking. It's so infected us. It's like you're either in, you're out, in group, out group. You got to do this. It's like that's that way of thinking is what's so devastating that's causing all these problems in this country and in these spaces is that, I tell people, I said, the sad thing is that so many people in the ex-Mormon community have essentially just gone and joined another cult because they would believe that the Church of Jesus Christ was Latter-day Saints is a cult. But unfortunately, I see a lot of cult-like behavior and activity in the ex-Mo space as well. That's even more toxic and so bad. And I feel bad about that because these people's lives, I mean, look, I understand going through the angry atheist phase. I was there, been through it, understand it. But you can't stay there forever.
Mhm.
And when you have hatred, I tell people said, one of the greatest ironies, and I want to be very careful here on how I say this, but I've said this before, and I'll say it again, is I had a person in the ex-Mormon space attack me on Facebook and say, and I don't, by the way, I don't want to make this about me. I'm just using these as examples. They're real
Yeah.
examples. This can be said, any podcaster could probably tell you similar things, but just based on my own experiences. And I think it's important to bring that to the table. I don't normally
Yeah.
even like to talk about myself in this space, but just a couple of weeks ago, I was accused of being a coward, and this person wanted to have me canceled because I platformed a particular Mormon apologist, and and this person was saying some horrible things, but not only that, but also wanted to cancel myself, cancel John DeLynn, cancel Bill Reel, cancel RFM. And I realized that this person, because of their far left mentality, ironically enough, probably hates more people than racists do numerically. And that's dangerous. Hatred in any form is dangerous, folks.
Mhm.
You gotta understand, like when I see hateful things said about people who are mourning the death of Charlie Kirk, when I see people say hateful things about Charlie Kirk, you ain't helping the situation much.
Yeah.
So, well, I want
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
continue.
I agree with basically all of what you just said. I think um another part of the question you asked me that I've been reflecting on, and you kind of commented on this, is you talked about responsibility and like what type of responsibility do you feel? And one thing I definitely have really always felt, as even since the time I was a kid, is I don't feel like I have to have an opinion about everything. And so if there was one thing I guess I'd ask people to think about is to maybe forestall judgment on some of these situations. Like right now, today, there are some things known about Charlie Kirk's murderer, and there are other things that are being speculated on. The bottom line is nobody knows right now. There's a lot of information that's being gathered, and there's a lot of information that's being offered to put this person into this camp or that camp, or they were radicalized by this or they were radicalized by that. We don't know yet. And the appropriate response when we don't know yet, we don't have sufficient information to reach a conclusion, is to withhold judgment. And this isn't just it's not just modeling like epistemic humility. It's also recognizing that when we've taken a public position on something, our brains automatically do not like admitting that we were wrong. And so we will engage, even subconsciously, in confirmation bias to not have to admit that we were wrong or change our minds. And so, one, I guess, invitation I would do, one thing I try and model is I recognize that I don't really have to hold and share an opinion with a bunch of people that don't know me on every topic. I don't, and neither do you. It's one of the greatest lies I think that social media and the advent of social media has taught us is that we need to move from whatever issue is causing social outrage to whatever issue is causing social outrage. And I want to be real clear. Some of those moments of social outrage are very important, and they're how we have conversations like the one we're having right now that can move things forward. But there's a signal to noise ratio problem that's been caused by social media where people need to fight about every little particular thing. And like you just don't have to. You don't have to fight about legislation that's going on in another state that's not even going to affect your life. And it's one of the weird things about the internet is like it's like Prometheus's fire, right? It's given us this great tool to connect ourselves, to connect each other, to connect us to information, and yet we're, I would say, more divided than ever, in part because of this problem with the signal to noise ratio. And so one thing I'm trying to do more is find conscious moments to unplug from the information overload that we experience as part of being just in this digital world that we inhabit. I think the other thing that goes along with the concept of responsibility, as you asked about it, is maintaining epistemic humility. And what I mean by that is, I talked earlier about definitions and getting to the definitions of terms if we're going to have a conversation. And while that's important, it's important to also remember that if someone defines a term differently than you, and maybe even atypically, and you think that definition is ridiculous, if the person's navigating the conversation in good faith, you can find ways to work around your difference on how you disagree, like on how you define the terms. You can find ways to do that, and one of the ways we can do that is by maintaining epistemic humility. And one related tip, I guess, one related responsibility I feel is to ask questions and not assume that I understand the other person's position or why they've reached the conclusions they have. If I haven't actually asked, I don't really have any basis to guess that I know what their positions are. And so I guess another tip, another responsibility I'd give folks is to ask a lot of questions. Don't, even when you're engaging in a discussion, instead of phrasing it like well, you think this, it should be what I'm hearing you say is X, Y, and Z. Is that accurate? Am I understanding your position? We need to seek more to understand the other person's position, even if we don't want to ultimately accept it, because otherwise we're just contributing to this echo chamber and straw man problem. We're not really understanding the position of the other person.
The other thing too is one of the key things you said earlier was you were going back and forth with that other attorney, and finally you said, "I'm just going to pick up the phone and talk to him."
Hmm.
And that to me is so important, folks. So there are times, a few times, I have chosen to engage my critics online, and after an hour and a half, 2 hours later, I'm like, I can't get those 2 hours back. That was an absolute waste of my time. And I'm like, I'm just going to quit doing this. So I literally just email people or text them or give them my contact information and say, let's just chat. And so this again, this is real world application. I'm trying to model how we can actually help defuse these situations. If you are a truth seeker and you really are genuinely interested in trying to create a space that's more civilized, um, you are just as responsible for creating this culture in many ways if you're behind the keyboard all the time just throwing out bombs at everybody. So I think we all need self-reflection here. What if I'm putting something out, I need to understand, okay, am I doing more harm than good here? Am I moving the conversation along in a productive way? Or are we just fighting these battles over and over again? I really feel like even when we've had conflicts on this channel, we've actually been able to move the conversation forward or increase better understanding of people's positions and where they're at, even when it's with Jacob Hansen and Jim Bennett, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, so I think it's really important that to call for everyone here. Yeah, if you are a keyboard warrior, close the laptop, pick up the phone, start talking to people. I think it's much better to do that. And also, for those of you who are interested, you need to understand something. People reach out to me all the time to facilitate conversations with people on the other side. It happens off the record typically. Maybe I just get the two people together to talk, or Jim Bennett contacts me and says, Steve, I want to talk to Jacob Hansen about Aaron Sherinian. Anywhere, anytime, any place. And can you help facilitate that conversation? Sure, Jim. Let me give Jacob a call. That's what we do all the time. But there's also stuff that happens off camera. So I'm just letting people know that, I'm willing to help facilitate conversations to help maybe build bridges and maybe just lower the temperature a little bit to get to humanize the other. And that's I think that's so important. And of course, many of you know that I use the term fellow image bearer. The recognition that the other on the other side, that you're yelling across the street and they're yelling at you and they got their signs and you got your signs. And God told me, he says, just remember that person across the street is a fellow image bearer. And whether you believe in God or not, that's not important because they're all members of the human community, a fellow member of the human community, my brother and sister. Tell people, about, I don't know, it was about 50 to 150,000 years ago. I forget the precise date. They actually have pretty much know exactly when it happened. I'm just going by top of my memory. There were only like 2,800 Homo sapiens on the planet. That there was this huge bottleneck that happened. That essentially we almost went extinct as a species. We are very close to it happening. I believe it was because of the humans, the Homo sapiens having the understanding, being hardwired spiritual animals, it gave us the opportunity to maybe see ourselves bigger than something else. That's why we have burial rituals. That's why we had all these things that maybe differentiated us from other species, is that we believed in an afterlife. We believed in God or something bigger than ourselves. We believed that we lived on after we died. I think that that's what caused us at that darkest moment where we're facing that bottleneck, where we as a species were about to die off. I think it was because of our inherent religiosity or spirituality that maybe was one of the factors that got us through that dark period of time. And that's why we as a species now have flourished on this planet. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are spiritual animals. But also, I think a real important thing, and this is one of the conversations Colby and I have been having, and if you want to comment on what I just said, you can.
Sure.
But I also want to just take it to another level too. And we've had this conversation. To kind of paraphrase Richard Dawkins, now if you had told me 20 years ago, when with the rise of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, Dawkins, Dennett, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, um, I would, if I had to guess who made this quote, would not have guessed this. But basically, of all the four, this would be the last person I would have expected this comment from. Richard Dawkins has recently, in the last year or so, and it was on Easter Sunday, said that he's glad that he is a cultural Christian and that he is glad that he lives in a Christian civilization. And he's actually grateful that he lives in a Christian society. And he calls himself a cultural Christian. Richard Dawkins, the person whom made fun of Christianity and said so many brutal things about religion in general, now acknowledges the importance of being a cultural Christian and being born into a Christian culture. And he actually feels that it's worth defending, worth fighting for. And I think that really the Western Christian values and the civilization that it created enables us, has given us all these wonderful tools to have these conversations in a civil way. Um, we don't want the return to barbarism. We want to continue to build our civilization, and I think the Western Christian civilization is worth. We need to at least understand our history, our past, and have some appreciation how unique of an experiment that is this American Republic as well. It's so there have been times when we've almost lost this thing, and we might be on the precipice of losing this great nation. It's very difficult. And Colby, maybe just address what I just said, my monologue here, because I think there's a lot of insights that you have to offer on this as well.
Yeah, sure. I actually want to start where you just ended, which is about the American experiment. A lot of people don't recognize how fragile and how rare what we have in America truly is. What I mean by that is in the year 1800, so the Constitution was largely shaped by two factions, right? We had the Federalists and we had the Anti-Federalists. We had the Federalists basically pushing for a strong central government, building from the ideas of Hobbes and Locke. And we had the Anti-Federalists pushing for the Bill of Rights, individual rights, states' rights. They were more focused on the individual than perhaps the Federalists were. It was that inherent tension that led to the Constitution. For people who don't know, that our Constitution wasn't the first governing document that we had. We had the Articles of Confederation, which largely failed because they did not allow a strong enough federal government. And so it was out of this tension that we had several presidents. We had Washington, we had Adams, and in the election of 1800, we had a shift in national attitude, and we had a shift from Adams to Jefferson, our third president. Jefferson was an anti-federalist, and Adams and Washington were the Federalist side, right? Madison kind of switched sides. One of the things about that I think people don't appreciate is in the year 1800, when the Federalists ceded power and the Anti-Federalists assumed the presidency and assumed the offices, that was the first peaceful transfer of power of a nation due to democratic will that had literally ever happened in the history of the world, as far as I'm aware. That is so significant and that's a result of the Constitution, of the checks and balances, of this idea of we the people. It's inherent in this idea of social contract theory, right? John Locke is probably the bigger influence for social contract theory on American law. But when you use the term fellow image bearer, and this is a conversation you and I have had before, one of the conversations I hope to have with people, because I am not religious, I do not believe in a God. But I would rather have conversations about the principles that I do share with people like you, with people of faith. And so when you use the term fellow image bearer, I'm able to, in my mind, go, I believe in the inherent sovereignty of every individual because of social contract theory. And I know what you mean by that. You mean that, what you see as God's divine imprimatur on each person, I see as the inherent worth of the individual. I don't care that we use different terms for that at this point. I really don't. It's more about the principle and about how we treat each other. And if we treat each other the same way, or we believe in treating each other the same way and treating other people the same way, I don't care that you use a different term than I do.
Mm.
So I think that's important. I think to comment on Dawkins and this idea of cultural Christianity,
Yeah.
I think, my Christianity, my time in the church was shaped more by the New Testament than it ever was by the Book of Mormon. I remember I had Joseph Smith's birthday is on December the 23rd, right? And I remember once when I was a teenager, fully believing, I had a Christmas Sunday that fell on Joseph Smith's birthday. And our entire ward did the entire Christmas Sunday program on Joseph Smith, on Joseph Smith's life. Literally, the only mentions of Jesus Christ were as a character in Joseph Smith's story. And I'm not downplaying that Joseph Smith is very important to that faith system. So don't get me wrong. But I'm just using this as an example to say that experience rubbed me really the wrong way. And I decided, even younger than that, that I was always going to be most dedicated to the character of Jesus Christ. And to me, the most important thing that, whether people believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ or just believe that the Bible has helped shape our society, which is just uncontestable. It's the most important book that's ever been written. Whether you believe it's true or not, that's just a fact. When I look at the words of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, to me, the most important ones, both as a believer and as a non-believer, where I can share Dawkins' comments about the value of cultural Christianity, is this idea of the golden rule, right? It's in Matthew 22, as well as other places. But this idea that I want to read it so that I have it right. I'll read the King James Version because I think that's what most of your audience is familiar with. It's Matthew 22, verse 34. It says, "But when the Pharisees had heard that he had gathered the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer," those lawyers, they're problematic, "asked him a question, tempting him, and saying, 'Master, which is the great commandment in the law?' Jesus said unto him, 'Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself.' On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." I want to give you my believing perspective on what that passage means. When it says on this law or on these commandments hang all the law and the prophets, the way I understood that as a Christian was that that was the constitution of Christianity. And what I mean by that is that set the bounds for
Mm.
what prophets and what commandments were really for. They were for our dedication to God, which in my view is like the idea of virtue ethics, like who are you and what principles do you apply to yourself? And then the second commandment, obviously treating others the way that they would wish to be treated or the way that you wish that they would treat you
Mm.
because of the love that you have for them. The way I viewed it was if there was ever any statement by any church leader that in my view, conflicted with those two great commandments because Jesus literally said, on these hang all the law and the prophets, there was part of me that basically said, that's if a prophet is saying something that's in clear tension with those, then for the purposes of this analogy, it's unconstitutional in a Christian sense. They've gone outside of their authority. That our religion should motivate us for love and dedication towards God, whatever you believe that is, and towards other people. And that's not to say that just like we can't have standards or that anything goes, but the way I viewed that was that exactly, was that if a prophet or a commandment or some biblical story goes outside the bounds of that and doesn't make sense to me in the lens of that framing, I just thought that that's where human error came from, or that that was the result of human error in trying to communicate with the divine. Today, that is the value I see in this idea of cultural Christianity. I think so long as people's Christianity is motivating them to their dedication to whatever ideal they strive for and to further that ideal in love towards other people, seeing other people in your term as an image bearer, in my term, seeing them as an autonomous individual whose sovereignty needs to be respected, that to me is the value of cultural Christianity. Now, the one place I would push back on what you said respectfully is I mean, we can show that this belief is not unique to Christianity and that it was predated in other faith systems. However, in America, where most people are going to learn this principle is through Christianity. And I would just be not being honest if I can't recognize that, even as an agnostic atheist myself. So that to me is the value of cultural Christianity. It doesn't necessarily turn on whether the message itself is, and by message I mean the underlying truth claims. It really doesn't matter if you think that Jesus rose from the dead, if you treat people in that way, in my view today.
So in one sense, you could say you're an originalist in the best sense of the term in that way as well. I actually love that, and I actually want to kind of apply that to, maybe I am in some level applying that already, but I really like the way you clearly articulated that lens of viewing things. And actually, I think it actually liberates people from hyper literalism as well, in which you can take, like this is the ultimate law that Christ is giving us. And then so we can even judge the characters of the Bible and the stories of the Bible through that lens. And also, I always tell people, I said, listen, I think sometimes men misattribute God and his intentions to do evil, even in the scriptures. I think that you can look at the early Hebrew scriptures as being a type of propaganda,
Hmm.
to kind of like a kind of creating like their origin story, and so they're trying to justify their actions as being commands from God.
Hmm.
Unless I have tablets that were written in the finger of God as evidence to show that they were receiving these messages from God, I have to be skeptical of their claims that they're making. I think that's fair to the text, and I think that's fair to history, and it's fair to our faith as well.
Hmm.
And I think that that's really important. I also think that what happens is that at the same time, and this is why it's really important, and why I grieve this rise of secular humanism. Now, when I say that, I mean, humanism is inherently a Christian value. Okay. Humanism was birthed out of Christianity in many ways and informed it. Even John Hamer will admit that in many of his conversations and videos he's done about Western civilization and stuff like that. But I sometimes think that when people have decided to take themselves out of the religious realm, I think it undermines this idea of being in the Christian culture and engaging. I tell people, I said, I wish Unitarians were still active believers because they could bring so much more to the table in the conversation in the Christian context, as opposed to, I mean, literally, I have a friend who's friends with a pastor of a Unitarian Universalist church, and he was thrown out of the church as the pastor because he said he was an agnostic. Well, for them, that was too conservative, that he was a conservative MAGA type and they needed to get rid of him. So we see the same mentality that's happening on these great mainline churches that for a long time informed the conversation in this country. And also we're very influential in the anti-slavery movement, very influential in many of the reform movements in the 19th and 20th century. Um, and to miss out, to have the mainline Protestants kind of disappear out of the conversation, and then just to have one faction of Christianity be the dominant voice, I think we all lose out on that because I really feel that tension that existed between the evangelical world and the Protestant world was actually a good thing, and it kind of kept both sides in check. And the fact that they've decided, the Protestants, essentially to become progressive, secular, that always leads to a path of non irrelevance at some point. I'm blabbering here. Maybe you want to kind of address that as well.
Um, well, when you talk about the relationship between evangelicals and Protestants, I'll honestly just admit that you have me at an advantage. I just don't know
Okay,
enough about
fair
those
enough.
communities. I'm not a member of those
Well,
communities.
what I'm talking about is, okay, so the evangelicals essentially were part of Protestantism, is a part of Protestantism.
Sure.
But mainline Protestants, and then you have more conservative evangelical fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Christians, maybe take the Bible more literally, but are much more active in the spreading of their faith to evangelize, as
Hmm.
opposed to the mainline institutions that just kind of they were the institutions that essentially governed this country for a very long time. They've
Hmm.
since withered away, and have been replaced by the evangelical wing of Protestantism. I feel like what I'm trying to say is that it was good when both were active and both were there having those. In many ways, you had evangelicals in mainline Protestant churches up until just a few decades ago that were still having these conversations. They've all since kind of split off, and I think we're missing something as a movement. That's why I feel like when you have these gatekeepers and all these other groups trying to gatekeep who can come and who can't go and who's a true Christian, who's not a true Christian, they're defeating the purpose of actually having these civil conversations in these groups. I'm probably does that clear? Is that a little more clear? Do you have a better understanding where I'm coming from? And both sides
Yeah.
gatekeep. Both sides gatekeep. Let's be very clear. It's not just one side here.
Yeah. I guess the way I'd put it is this, right? Jesus himself gave one test for who a Christian is or who a disciple is. It's if you have love one to another. I I'll just tell you, as someone who would describe themselves best as an atheist agnostic, when I look at the fighting back and forth between religious believers who are usually each claiming God is on their side and that they know it's a little absurd to me looking at it from the outside in, because if that's the test that Jesus himself gave, it feels like it should be readily apparent. And I don't see a whole lot of love in those exchanges back and forth. I think, and I think that's kind of what I was saying about my idea of constitution, what I viewed as the constitution of Christianity, and in fact still would argue it is it seems to me like the gatekeeping and the you're not a true Christian. I also hate it when people in the evangelical camp do it to Mormons. Like, as a Mormon, my relationship was primarily with Jesus Christ. If that's not a Christian, I don't know what is. And I guess that's where my mind goes.
Mm.
I think the other thing, just to kind of comment on, since I offered that model to you that I used to use, one thing I like about that model, like you said, is that it allows for you to not hold certain biblical stories or commandments or whatever as literally or as fundamental, like as a fundamentalist would, but it's also not completely unmoored from a standard. You have a standard. In my view, there was a very clear, articulable standard that I could point to, and I felt like was justified by the words of Christ. And so I saw a real advantage in that approach. I guess the other thing I'd say about like the interfaith discussion, and even when people of faith have discussions with people who are not of faith, comes back to the concept we were talking about as far as epistemological humility goes. I would love to see believers be more honest about when they've accepted certain things based on faith. That's one of the things that I've told you repeatedly and have mentioned on other podcasts that I love about our conversations is you are very honest about, what you believe based on evidence and what you believe based on experience and faith. Um, I think that makes it a lot easier for us to have conversations between people of faith and people who are not of faith. It's when people of faith, I would say, overrepresent or misrepresent, maybe unintentionally, um, overrepresent whether their truth claims of their religious beliefs are evidently true, meaning they can point to some piece of evidence that says, like, here's why insert whatever you want. Why the Book of Mormon is historical. Why Jesus did rise from the dead. There are some things in religion that just have to be believed based on faith. And then, if we can be honest about that conversation, both from the believing and non-believing side, then we leave it to the listeners or the people who are in that wrestle, trying to decide which camp they want to fall into, to decide if they view faith as a valuable epistemological currency or not. I think that's when we get into trouble. And I'm not just saying that it happens on the believing side. There are obviously bad arguments from atheists. I hear them all the time. But I think that's where I come back to this idea of epistemological humility and just being a little bit more honest about the reasons for why we've reached certain conclusions. And if that reason is faith, I just wish people would be a little bit more honest about that sometimes.
And just so for the sense of maybe terms and understanding, I've used the term epistemological humility a lot as well. It's actually a term that John Dehlin taught me, mentioned to me, and I latched onto it right away. How do you define epistemological humilities for our audience who may not be familiar with that term?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I say it, I think the best way to explain it is like this quote, which is that we need to hold our opinions loosely. And what I mean by that is it's absolutely admirable to have strongly held opinions when we're certain. But I think to come back to like an idea from David Hume that I think describes it very well, he said one time in one of his books that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. To me, the idea of epistemological humility is there are certain things that would be like paradigm shifting, right? If someone were to overturn the germ theory of disease, for example, they've got to have some really, really solid evidence to do that because we have such solid evidence that that's the way the universe works. But we need to be open to the fact that it is possible, like that our minds can change. That's one of the beauties I see in basically like the scientific method and the scientific worldview at its best is that it is inherently always subject to change. All of the models are wrong. All of the models we have about the way we understand the universe are wrong. Every single one of them. but some of them are useful. And that's where I think this idea of epistemological humility is very important. It simply means that we're holding our opinions with the respect that we might be wrong. Like we keep in mind always that we might be wrong. That's the way I would describe it.
I love it. I love it. And I also just want to point out too is that, the scientific method is birthed out of the scholastic movement, which was a Catholic academic, and people make
Sure,
fun of them because they're saying like, oh yeah, back then they were saying how many angels can be on the tip of a
sure.
pin and stuff like that. But it was those conversations, that kind of process that maybe people make fun of the conversations they're having, but it was actually helped develop the process of the scientific method that gives us a really valuable tool that I think we should be grateful to them for.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think relatedly too, when we're talking about epistemological humility, I feel like it also turns on understanding critical thinking, and trying to apply the best tools we have and avoiding the use of logical fallacies. And that's not to say that anyone who uses a fallacy or an argument that's a fallacy is automatically wrong. That's actually known as the fallacy, right? But a fallacy, by definition, is an argument that can't lead you to a true conclusion, right? Every informal logical fallacy is a non sequitur. The conclusion does not fall from the premise. And like the classic example I always give is the bandwagon fallacy. This idea that, well, how could, 17 million people be wrong? How could 100 million people be wrong? It That's the fallacy of the bandwagon, is believing that the majority's opinion is more likely correct than any other, when in reality, that argument doesn't have any relation to whether that argument is actually true or real. It is fallacious thinking. And all of us, I think, as a matter of epistemological humility, need to try and avoid logical fallacies whenever we can. If there are good reasons for what we believe, we need to offer those good reasons, not the bad arguments.
Mm, yeah. So, trying to think here. When 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 we talk about the importance of being in a Christian culture, being having the privilege of being in a Christian culture, do you really like, do you think that that that's an important value that we need to maintain in this country? That if we lose the our identity, our cultural history, our shared values that that founded this country. I'm not saying this was a Christian nation per se, but it was a nation
Sure.
founded by Christians and
Sure.
deists, but they still believed in God. And so, do you feel like if we were to move away from that, and move in a different direction, do you think that could be harmful to our country and to its people?
Oh, could be harmful, absolutely. Does it need to be harmful? No. I think that's where it really comes down to what direction are we moving. So I have, like I have just said with this idea of like where I see the constitution of Christianity. I think so long as Christianity is tethered to that and is moving in that direction, I have no qualms about it, even as a person who doesn't share that belief. So I would say that's a valuable part of a pluralistic society, is keeping that. Now, you and I could both list Christian groups that I would say are completely divorced from that constitution of Christianity. To me, the perfect example is like Fred Phelps in the Westboro Baptist Church, to go and protest service members' funerals with slurs, and right across from the funeral where the family is grieving. That's just as unhinged behavior as what we've seen from some people celebrating Charlie Kirk's death, right? It's the same basic lack of civility, lack of concern for other people. So I guess to answer your question, it really depends on what we mean by the Christianity. It depends on the flavor of Christianity if I think moving that direction is a good thing or if I think moving that direction is a harmful thing. But I think moving away from that, like say society continues to secularize, it entirely depends on what we agree the new foundations are. And I think, and John Delen's been very open about this, I think one of the greatest failures of people who've left faith is that I'll say failures, but I'll also say it's an understandable failure in that people leave religion for many different reasons. And so the people who leave religion are not a monolith, nor are believers, but they are at least centered around you know, a core of usually common beliefs, right? Every Christian essentially believes in the resurrection of Jesus Christ at bare minimum. Um, One of the difficulties I think in the secular space or in the atheistic space is you don't necessarily have that shared foundation. And in fact, if you do have a shared foundation, this is one of the criticisms of the ex-Mormon space that sometimes I agree with. The shared foundation is in response to something. It's when I say anti, I don't mean like the way that TBMs would use the term anti-Mormon, but it's responsive to the church, right? There are people who obsess and have obsessed for 25 years about every little thing the church does, even though they haven't been a member for 25 years. Um, that to me is probably missing the mark on what the purpose of having a life is. Um, and so I think when you ask me the question, what will happen to society, it's entirely dependent on what we agree to and what foundations we want to establish. It could be better. It could be worse. It entirely depends on this exchange of ideas, like we're modeling today, and people being honest about where they want society to go.
Well, I also, one of the conversations we've been having is like, well, there are other what if scenarios. What if we didn't become a Christian society and we chose a different path in a different direction? And we've kind of done some thought experiments on that, and maybe just maybe articulate that because I think it's important for us to talk about that too.
You're saying articulate the idea of like what would have happened if, say, Christianity would have died on the vine.
Right.
Uh,
Never became the religion that it has become. It maybe somewhere in the hinterlands, but has no effect on the culture or on civilization. In other words, do you think that overall Christianity has been a force for good for human civilization? Do you think that there maybe were other alternative pathways that might have been superior to Christianity? Can you find models of in the history of our species that you would say that would be a better road to go as a civilization than a Western Christian direction? Keeping in
Man,
mind that all the values that you have are come from the Christian civilization that you came from. Even though your understanding, I even tell people that atheism is really just a form of Protestantism taken to its logical extreme.
mhm.
Protestantism basically was we're going to stand up against the vicar of Christ. Well, if you're willing to do that and put your neck on the line back then, that's only one step away from basically saying you're an atheist, right? Back in that context. So to me, even atheism as we understand it, secularism, humanism, um, come out, even the Enlightenment, all come out of this Christian mindset. And I always tell people that atheists are very Christian in their approach in many ways when they see the brokenness of this world and say, I don't want to have anything to do with a God that had anything to do with this. Therefore, I choose not to believe in God in that sense. Now, of course, people come to arrive at different conclusions, but I do say that, it's a very Christian understanding of the brokenness of this world. So even atheism the conversation atheism is having is a very Christian conversation at the same time. You want to address any of what I just said?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's inherent in the name, right? Like atheist means that you don't believe in the existence of God. And so, a lot like I said about the ex-Mormon position, right? It's
Hmm.
you're an ex-Mormon. You're
Right.
responsive to that community, to that belief system. Atheism inherently is going to be that way. As far as your question about potential realities, I
Hmm.
think the reality is it's really difficult to know.
Yeah.
I think that. Um, I think that we could have lived in a much more barbaric civilization if we wouldn't have had the influence of Christianity. But I also think um, we would be remiss if we didn't recognize that while Christianity has done many great things for our culture, it has also given us a lot of baggage.
Mm.
I would say that like the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment are responsive to some of Christianity's darkest days.
Sure.
The Inquisition. You mentioned slavery earlier, right? And I know I used this line with you on the phone, but when Christians, motivated by their Christianity, ended the Atlantic slave trade and worked towards emancipation, They weren't working against atheists and they weren't working against secularists. They were working against other Christians that believed the Bible justified Christianity. That kind of relates to your question about what do you think happens to society if Christianity either gets stronger or wanes, waxes or wanes in our society? Well, it depends on what the flavor of Christianity we're dealing with, right? If we go back to the 1850s, 1830s, 1820s, and we have that conversation on, which branch of Christianity prevails in its worldview regarding slavery, we can see we could open a door to a very dark reality or the reality we live in today. So I guess this is the way I would put it. Any worldview brings with it inherent advantages and disadvantages. There are many advantages we got from Christianity being the cultural force that it was in the West. But I think it is very naive. And I do see this claim a lot from Christians to believe that basically they can attribute to Christianity every good thing that's happened in the West and ignore the other influences that we've had. And
Absolutely.
in doing that, they often downplay the problematic aspects of
Certainly.
Christianity and that Christianity has had on the world. So the reality is, do I think there could be a better system? Yeah, I'm open to that possibility. Like I said, I really like the fact that the scientific model builds into it self-corrective mechanisms, but I'd be naive if I didn't recognize that many people, some who are professors, I would say more people who are not, but they can turn science into its own form of religion, right? When they're holding any belief, whether it's religiously motivated or not, that's held to like this dogmatic position of I can't possibly be wrong to me is inherently dangerous. That's not to say that we can't have principles and hold things that are important to us dear, but I think epistemological humility, to return to a question you asked me earlier, means always being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
So I want to propose to you this idea is that we can actually argue that there are alternative worlds in which we can see this experiment happening,
Sure.
and that is outside of Western Christian
Right.
civilization.
Right.
So I just one of the most interesting things for me was I was always been fascinated by the whole uh, Handmaid's Tale genre.
Sure.
I call it the progressive
Dystopian.
apocalypse. Yeah,
Yes.
dystopian. It's like I call it like the atheist Left Behind series, if you will. And I,
It's really all Orwell, right?
yeah,
So, or was birthed with Orwell and Huxley.
yeah.
Yeah.
But with the Handmaid's Tale, what's so fascinating to me, it's this what if scenario. What would happen if the dark forces of Christianity were to take over this country and rule it, right? And what they did to the women
Mhm.
in this series, how they were mistreated, a very patriarchal society. I mean, it's a nightmarish scenario of a form of Christianity that does in some quarters does exist. I don't deny this.
Right.
But then all these progressives love this series. They talk about the books, and of course, you had the whole HBO series. I watched the first season, and then when I got into the second one, I said, "Oh, I see where they're going. I'm not interested." But I thought the first season was really I found it very compelling, and even the premise. I watched the original movie when it came out. But then I tell people that there was like, oh my gosh, we got to be aware of this. We got to stop this. We got to prevent this from happening. But at the same time, the Handmaiden Tale actually exists in our real world,
Mm.
in countries by the second largest religion in the world, wherever that country where that religion is dominant, we have a de facto Handmaiden's Tale
Mhm.
scenario being played out at this moment. We also even see slavery being practiced in those societies at this moment. Okay. So for me, I look at it and say, there's a parallel of a non-Christian Western civilization. They show us exactly one direction that you could go. And the question, and look, and I would argue empirically, the Western Christian civilization has been greatly a force for good, just in the number of Nobel Peace Prizes that have
Mhm.
been awarded to people from Western Christian cultures, including Judeo-Christian cultures, overwhelming any other culture in this country. So in the world. So I would say just using the contributions that Western Christian cultures have made to science and the betterment of humanity is a great argument in favor of Christianity. That I don't think other cultures and civilizations and worldviews come even close. I mean, this could sound really like like I'm making a, but I'm just making an argument based on facts. I mean, I don't think there's anything that I'm saying that is incorrect. Maybe you could, and people want to correct me, that's fine. But maybe speak to that, because actually my argument is we do have these alternate parallel universes happening, right? And we can see the experiment played out in real time.
Yeah. I think one thing I'd say to that is first, in modeling epistemological humility, I want to note that you and I were both raised in Western Christian civilization, right? We were raised in this culture, and we cannot separate ourselves from the water that we were raised in basically exclusively. And so I don't necessarily disagree with anything you just said. I just want to note that to say we really are judging by the standard of Western civilization and Western Christianity, other cultures that don't fit it. And so it's probably unsurprising that it doesn't match. The fact that they don't match doesn't necessarily make one better or worse than the other. Now, I think that's where we look at like specific things. We look at specific advantages and disadvantages. You highlighted oppression of women in certain religious systems and even, theocratic societies. Um, we can't close our eyes to that. We can't close our eyes to the fact that that's a disadvantage.
Mhm.
There are advantages in other cultures. I mean, I told you this story right after I graduated high school. I had the opportunity to travel to China. And one of the things I was really surprised by is like in the East, in the Eastern culture, while the West and the culture we've been talking about, the culture we were raised in, has this idea of the individual almost being prime, right? That society is a collection of individuals and individuals have individual rights. My experience having been in China and seeing their model is it's more of a collectivist model. I don't mean that like in the terms of like economic socialism or economic communism necessarily. It's from the ground up a model that's more about a collective, whether it's a family, a nation, a tribe, a village. Um, there are advantages to that approach in the sense that it can be more dedicated to common goals, but it runs the risk of common goals overpowering the rights and the autonomy of the individual. In the West, I would say sometimes we run into the exact opposite problem, which is oftentimes our respect for individual rights and individual liberties can pose huge impediments on collective goal solving problems. So I'm going to do the very standard lawyer thing of not really answer your question directly, but just say, when I think about these alternatives, I look at it in terms of like advantages and disadvantages. And that's where we need to have a conversation about what those specific advantages and disadvantages are in different models and different societal models. And and I'll just say I value individual rights and individual freedom, so I prefer this model, but I'd be naive to not recognize that, well, of course I do. It's the model I was raised in, and it's the water that I was shaped by, right?
Yeah, that's fair, but I also would say that what's so fascinating to me is that the best and brightest people in China, they send their kids to American universities and European
Yeah.
universities.
I was going to make that comment as well.
You know,
It'd be undeniable to recognize that the West and America in particular
mhm.
haven't been a beacon for people to draw to get the best advantages.
And I'd also say that when there were um, when there was a lot of revolutions and stuff and instability going in the Middle East, where do they go? They came to the West
Mhm.
to flee for protection. It just seems to me there's this an inherent understanding from all other people groups in this world that the ideal, the place where that they can better their lives, the place that they could get a better education, the place that they can feel safe is in Western Christian civilization in a way that I don't see it happening the other way. I just think that's an important data point that we have to think about.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. I would just also add the caveat that I view most of the advantages not necessarily being directly tied to like the truth claims of Christianity. And in my view, many of those advantages of the West come out of the Enlightenment. Now, obviously, the Enlightenment was inspired by Christian
Mhm.
thinkers,
Yep.
but I would say it was largely a response to the Inquisition and some of the horrors
Yeah.
of Christianity at its political
right.
apex.
But also keeping in mind too that that I think the Enlightenment really takes off in Protestant culture,
Right,
and it's a response. Protestantism was a response to Catholicism as well, and so
right.
that's actually where you can even take it another level and show that empirically that countries that are Protestant in their nature often thrive better on many of these same points than Catholic countries.
Mhm.
So I'm even taking it a little further and say that, Protestant Christianity has also even been a really great force for good, especially look, it ushered in essentially the modern era, right? I mean, it helped usher it in from being in the Dark Ages to an enlightenment of Protestantism and an enlightenment happening. These are really important things that are happening, and it informs our republic. Both the Enlightenment and Christianity and Protestantism in
Mhm.
particular play a major role. So I'm going so far as to say that even Protestant Christianity overall has been a force for good. That it's actually an improvement on the old model of Christianity and actually helped propel us to give us the modern values that we believe in.
Yeah. And we often see that, right? Like in the legal system, for people who haven't listened to us talk before, I'm a lawyer, so that was my lawyer joke earlier. That's the explanation for my lawyer joke earlier. But oftentimes we see that not just in cultural movements, but in the legal system, where something will go too far, and then the pendulum will swing back to prevent it from ever swinging that far again. The example that I think of right off the top of my head is like in response to the Great Depression in the 1920s, we had the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We had the creation of um, really the first of the social safety net programs to prevent people from starving in the streets. And people can have their whatever political opinion they want about where society should go. But I guess one of the other things I believe in pretty strongly is that the systems that have evolved in our society and in our legal system usually evolve in response to a specific problem. And it's not to say that we're completely tied to the past, but we need to evaluate the history and the reasons those things were put in place, those guardrails were put in place before we can make a considered offer of change. Um, you talked earlier about the tension between like um, evangelicalism and Protestantism and how that inherent tension kind of was healthy. I actually agree with that when we talk about, I'm going to use the term like small c conservative. I'm not just talking about Republicans, but when we talk about small c conservatism and we talk about progressivism, there's a beautiful tension in that too. This idea that we need to reshape institutions and that no, we need to keep institutions the same way. It's that that tension itself is actually meaningful and it helps inform both halves of this. Yes, we want to improve working towards America's common goals. But no, we don't want to change everything and we don't want to change everything too fast. There's some beauty in that tension as well.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And I think that's why, and again, I think civilizationally, I think we're able to do this and have these conversations because of the idea of having certain inalienable rights endowed by us by our Creator.
Right.
And I think that's really why it's so important that we remain attached and tethered to our Christian culture, because I look at other cultures and I think even as messed up as things are, and again, I think Richard Dawkins came around to this idea of being grateful to be calling himself a cultural Christian. Because I think he's as he's living in this world and he's seeing things happening and realizes like, you know, and I would be executed if I was born in the wrong country with the beliefs that I have. I'm grateful I was born in a Christian culture. Uh, and again, and keeping in mind, if Richard Dawkins was born 500 years ago in Western Europe, he would have been excommunicated. I mean, killed for being an
Executed.
atheist, right? So let's be fair. But I also think that there's a certain inherent evolution away from barbarism that we see that's continuing, and it speaks to this idea of even continual reformation. That's what the idea with Protestantism is, that it wasn't just a one-time event. It's an ongoing, continuing reformation to continue. And I think that that can be applied where we can have seen this continued reformation going on in the betterment of our society and our culture. I think these are all good things. I think that it's interesting that it was Christian cultures that were the first. Historically, all of human civilization had slavery, but it was the
Hmm.
Christian cultures that made it illegal first.
Hmm.
Okay. And there's cultures to this day that are practicing slavery who are still in the dark ages. So
Yeah.
I just think when we just look at the totality of this, and again, I'm not trying to be like a supremacist here, or like the West is best, and I'm trying to be like some kind of really I don't want people to come across. I'm just this is just a conversation I think that's important to have, because this is reflective of the broader conversations that are happening in our society as well. And I think it's important that we're able to have this talk, Colby and I, to have this conversation, because we can show that, we can have disagreements and agreements and be civil in our approach, and both acknowledge that we are both products of our Western culture as well at the same time. And so I'm kind of just making these points because I want this to be a thought experiment. For those of you who really feel like America just sucks, and you hate this country, and you hate Christianity, and you think it's in this horrible force for evil, and we need to abolish it, and we need to just overthrow. I mean, we can just look at France as an example where they did this, and it really, France is not a direction I'd want our society to go in as well, to go aggressively secular like they have. Like now you can't even wear publicly, if you're a government employee, you can't even have a cross on you. So it goes so many different directions where we can look at we can even see within what the West some experiments happening that maybe I wouldn't want to follow, like an aggressive secular policy that you see in France that it does because they don't have a First Amendment. Um, so I don't know, dude. I'm just kind of rambling a little bit here, but I really feel like there's so much evidence to me in my mind, again, being a creature of the West, and I'm sure there's values that we can learn from other civilizations, and I think we should
Right.
take the best from those cultures and integrate it into our own, much like China did, where essentially, look, they turned their backs on a lot of their traditions and their culture and embraced the Western mindset when it came to their economy. And as a result, 350 to 400 million people went from poverty into the middle class in a generation.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a lot. I said a
Yeah.
lot there, but I
Well,
think
no, but I think it's really good concluding thoughts. And the way you put it, like making sure, we open by talking about shared principles, right? Like even if we disagree on the reason for something, we can agree on the principle. And I think one of the things I've recognized is that there are a lot of people who either leave Mormonism or they leave whatever religion, and they immediately pivot to like, if the church told me to do this, I'm not going to do it anymore because, screw the church. They took all these things from me. All of those feelings are valid. The feelings of hurt and betrayal, all of those feelings are valid. I felt all of them. But the fact that the church told you to do certain things doesn't make those things wrong. And let me give you a perfect example. When when we left, my wife and I had three kids. We still have three kids. And we're only going to have three kids. Um, we substituted family scripture and prayer time for family time and a meditation exercise. I don't want to say we do it every night, but 5, 6 times a week if we don't have late stuff going on. And that time to reflect and bond and um, have some repose as a family is a very important principle, not just for families, but for individuals too, right? To have this time of reflection. That's really what I would say is the magic behind prayer, is this time to be alone, to reflect. Whether you believe you're connecting with a God or not, we need time to separate and reflect on what we think is important. And recreating that with my family has helped me see the value of the thing, the principle, and disconnect it from the truth claims that I was handed as a kid. And I think that's where it comes down to is like if people are leaving religion, if society generally is going to leave religion, it's about extracting the best practices and principles that we can from that belief system. And I that's where I see the value in cultural Christianity that we've talked about today.
Well, all I can say is you just seem like you're just a typical Protestant, my friend, in so many ways. You just kind of have your own church. Like I tell people, said, Protestantism, evangelicalism is part of the Protestant movement, but really, Protestantism, another form of Protestantism taken to its logical extreme is a really strong individualistic worldview in which you could be a church of one,
Mm.
and do your own type of Christianity and it'd be okay. And I think, that's kind of what's happening in your sense too. Your whole framework, your whole worldview is still structured in a Christian context. And so you're
Sure.
taking the good parts. And again, that's how Protestants do. It's like, well, I don't like that part of that church. So let's start a church and we just take the good things that we learned from that. And it's kind of like, so it's a very Protestant thing that you're doing as well in one sense. And so I don't know. I just think it's great that you are finding value in what you found growing up in your church. And you, matter of fact, you, in many ways, if certain things didn't happen in your local ward that you've talked about, you probably still would be a member in this church, in many ways. So I
Mhm.
think that in many ways Mormonism works. In many ways Christianity works. And for those of you who it doesn't work for, I think you still need to try to find some tools some good positive things that you got out of your religious experience that you can integrate. Like John Dehlin says, he's so grateful he served a mission. It really helped him make him the person who he is, and will forever be grateful that he served that mission. And so he finds value in Mormonism as well, and in Christianity in general. And I think that that's really this is a very unique time and place that we have as a species. Um, this whole thing could get burned to the ground, and that's what I'm concerned about is the state of our nation and our civilization. And if we burn this whole thing down, what are we going to replace it with? I think that's really something that we all on all sides need to ponder. Okay. And again, I try to be as tolerant as I can and as open as I can to all different ideas and different faiths and different peoples and cultures. And I've had Buddhists on, atheists on. I've been in contact with Muslims and Jewish, and I've had Jewish rabbis on my program. I really think it's important that also just we have these really important conversations with people that are in other groups and realize that they, in my sense, in my understanding, that they are image bearers and find. I always tell people, I said the problem with a lot of Christians dealing with Mormons is that they're always looking for the devil in the details. They're always looking for the devil. And I always tell people, why don't you look for the Jesus? And if you look for the Jesus, you're going to find a lot more people that share your values that you could possibly imagine. And I think that's kind of how we all need to operate there. Colby, I hope I didn't ramble too much today, but I had a lot on my heart. And I really feel like I think this is the beginning of a series of conversations I'd like to have with you and others, and probably maybe have me do one-on-ones or have you as a co-host on, whenever we think it's appropriate for the
Sure.
guest and the topic. Was there any final parting words you'd like to share with the audience?
No, you know, I this might surprise people because I don't believe in Mormonism anymore. But the first thought I had in watching the response to Charlie Kirk's assassination was there's this passage in Moses 7. So Joseph Smith scripture, right? Like Joseph Smith created scripture is what I mean. Um, where it's supposedly or purportedly, whatever you want to say, in the narrative, it's a conversation between God and Enoch. And Enoch asks God in this very beautiful poetic language why God weeps, right? This is the idea that Terrell Givens talks about all the time, this God who weeps. It's from Moses 7. And in response to that, God says something like, um, he's upset at humanity because he's given them commandment to love one another and they hate their own blood is the phrase that he uses. And I don't care if people find value in that because they're still TBM, they're Mormon, they're ex-Mormon. We need to return to a place and we need to find greater ability to see the humanity or the image bearer in the people that we talk to and even the people that we do not like. And if people are doing that because they're motivated by Christianity like you, or they're doing that because they're motivated to see those people as autonomous individuals like me, um, I don't care. But we need to figure out how we're going to treat each other because otherwise, it, like you said, then it just leads to burning it all down. And I don't think people recognize how damaging that would be for all of us.
I love it. And I love that you quoted Mormon scriptures in this. And you and I have had many conversations about the Book of Mormon and what is scripture. And I think that I would love for us that maybe to be our next conversation because to me, I love talking about the Book of Mormon in particular.
Hmm.
I think there's so many ways, imaginative ways that we can approach the text and its origins. And Colby and I have had a series of conversations about that. And I think that should be our next conversation, Colby. What do you think?
Cool. Cool. Yep. I'm up for it.
Awesome sauce. That's great, folks. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in the comments. We really do want to, we're hopeful that this will be an impetus for or to start more positive conversations. And maybe I really want people to really implore you to listen to the conversation we had today. And if you want to offer critiques, the constructive critiques for both Colby and I, we welcome that. We want to be if we said something wrong or we misspoke, we want to be corrected. Because again, we want good information out there and truthful information to be put out there. Um, I want to just thank everybody for taking the time to listen to this episode. We'll have links in the description for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel. It is greatly appreciated. Couldn't do it without you. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.